I got the count now. It's just 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes. Or
Just starting right now?
You're good. Yeah.
We're good to go. People see us now.
Yes.
Online.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, chat. I'm Matthew Poppe. I'm the community marketing artist for Intercept Games. Been here about a year. Long time Kerbal player. Been there since the beginning. About a year ago, when I started here, I was the only member of the community team who really had a lot of experience in Kerbal, and the other members of the community didn't so much. And so, as part of the community, my job became kind of like, why don't I just give people Kerbal lessons and explain rocket science and explain all the things that I've learned over the past decade of playing Kerbal. And it became kind of a regular thing, and now we have an internal Slack channel for it where I can post tutorials and things like that. And we wanted to take it public and see how it does. So here I am today with a couple of, a new recruit and an old recruit.
Oh, man.
And another recruit. Say hi, Dakota.
Hello.
All right. Did I ruin your camera, Dakota?
No.
Okay, good. All right, so we're going to do a little presentation. And this is going to be Rocket Science 101. If you're familiar with Kerbal Space Program, you probably know a lot of these concepts, but that's okay. I want them all to live in one place for posterity so that we can go back and review. So I'm just going to start from the very beginning. How do rocket work? How do space work? And the best place probably to start is a little thought experiment called Newton's cannon, which you may have heard of. So this is Isaac Newton. He was a wizard. He lived a long time ago, and he figured out some of the rules of the universe. One of which, objects in motion stay in motion unless something stops them. So if you have an object moving through a vacuum, it will keep moving in that direction forever. Also, he figured out the rules of gravity, so the force of gravity is proportional to the mass of two bodies and inversely proportional to the distance between them. Yeah, absolutely.
How did he prove that? The thing stayed in motion forever. How would he do that back then?
That is a very good question. I don't know the specific answer to it. He was a genius, for one thing.
Good enough.
The answer is he was a genius. How exactly he derived that stuff? I mean, it's based on earlier things, like Galileo did some experiments with gravity and falling objects, and a few others. But anyway, so there's this thought experiment called Newton's cannon where he explains basically how orbit works. So let's say you have the Earth here, and it's a big round ball. Here's the Earth, and you have a cannon on top of a tall mountain, and you shoot a cannonball out of the cannon, like that. Well, let's make sure it's in here. There we go. Shoot a cannonball off the top of the mountain sideways with a cannonball. Now, if this is a normal cannon, and this is the size of the Earth, well, the cannonball is probably not going to go very far. All right, it's going to shoot out and start falling towards the center of the Earth because gravity's pulling it down as it moves, and it will hit the ground here and go kersplat. And if you do a really scary thing called calculus, you will find that this path that the cannonball followed is a portion of an ellipse that looks like this. That was a very badly drawn ellipse, but
You dropped that.
it looks like that. And the center of the Earth is at the focus, one focus of the ellipse. And this is an orbit. It's not a very good orbit because it hit the ground, but it is an orbit. This is a suborbital, I guess, trajectory. What's chat saying? Are they making fun of me?
They thought it was funny that you said kersplat.
Kersplat. Okay.
Kersplat.
Oh, kersplat. All right, good.
So you're saying like every time I throw something like a ball or whatever, that's
Yeah,
happening?
yeah, it's on a suborbital trajectory, but you could consider that an orbit. So, if you, let's say, that wasn't very successful, but if we put more powder in the cannon or had a smaller cannonball or a longer cannon and we made the cannonball shoot even faster, then it would shoot out further and fall down and kersplat over here somewhere. And the ellipse, instead of being kind of small like that, would get larger. You can imagine it curving through more of the Earth. The low point of the ellipse that's inside the Earth would be raised up. And so you can see kind of where this is going. If you make the cannonball go faster and faster, eventually you can have a cannon shot that is so powerful that the cannonball will just keep going around the Earth. Gravity keeps pulling inwards towards the Earth. The cannonball keeps wanting to just move forward forever, and if there's nothing to stop it, it'll just keep going around the Earth forever and ever. And this is how things stay in orbit. This is how things stay in space once they are put into space. And this goes even further. So if you were to put even more powder in the cannon, here's our circular orbit, put even more powder in the cannon, make a bigger cannon, shoot the cannonball even faster, the orbit would stretch out even more. The cannonball would be flung away from the Earth, and the Earth basically has less time to pull on it. And so it goes further away from the Earth, where gravity is weaker, incidentally, thanks to this guy here. Gravity's weaker further from the Earth, and so the ellipse stretches further out, and then it swings back down to the cannon. And you can keep going further and further than this. If you keep firing the cannonball faster, making it go faster, eventually it will turn into a parabola, and it won't even have a top. Your orbit won't even have a high point or an apoapsis. And that velocity, which is for the Earth, is about 7,800 meters per second. Jack can check me on that. It's almost 8 kilometers per second. That's escape velocity. So if you've heard the term of escape velocity, that's what it means. Something's moving so fast that Earth's gravity never has enough time to hold on to it, and it's never going to come back. So the principle of this is if you want to go to space and stay in space, you have to go really fast. You just have to speed up to some incredible speed, and that's how you get going places in space. Now, a cannon is not very practical as a vehicle. I mean, we could imagine putting people in a little capsule and shooting that capsule into space, but that wouldn't go very well. Although it was proposed as a method of space travel before rockets were a thing. But fortunately, there are a few other rules that can help us out. Isaac Newton's rule number 3, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So every time we were firing that cannonball, pushing the cannonball away from the cannonball was pushing back on the cannon. And I guess in this example was making the Earth spin very slowly in the opposite direction. So we can make a vehicle kind of like this. And this is another famous example that is sometimes used to explain how rockets work, where let's say you have a cannon and it's sitting on a cart, on some wheels, on a very, very greased railroad track or something like that, and you put a cannonball in it, you shoot it. Well, the cannonball will go this way, and the force of the separation will push the cannon and the cart in the opposite direction, and you'll speed up to some velocity, whatever it is. And you can do it again and again. Load in another cannonball, fire another shot, speed up again. Another cannonball, another shot, speed up again, and keep going. And eventually you'll run out of cannonballs and you'll be going at some speed until something stops you. Friction, or you run into something, or whatever. And a rocket is basically just that. It's a tank of stuff, some kind of stuff. In the case of a rocket, it's propellant. And then you have an engine, which is something that can squirt the propellant really, really fast, pushes the rocket in the opposite direction, and that's how the rocket changes its velocity. So, now that we have a vehicle that can change our velocity, how do we, go places? Well, earlier, we have Newton's cannon here. We can shoot into orbit like that, but we've already figured out how to make a rocket. So, to get into orbit, this is Kerbal numbers. KSP players will recognize these. These are Kerbal numbers. Where you can go in space and how far you can go in space is limited by how much your rocket can change its speed total. So how much your rocket can accelerate or decelerate. So in this example, we're going to go land on the Mun. You need about 3,500 meters per second to get into orbit. And then to expand your orbit out so that it is high enough that it will reach the Mun, you need to speed up by another 900 meters per second. Once you get there, you and the mun will not be going the same speed. It's going to be whipping by you, and you need to change your velocity again. You need to slow down or speed up relative to the mun by another 300 meters per second. And then to land, you need to stop, slow down, and then lower yourself gently, which means you need to slow down from orbit again by another 600 or so meters per second. And you add all that up. Whoops. You add all that up, and you get 5,300. And then you need even more to go back home. So, to go to different places in space, you want to make sure that your rocket can change its velocity by as much as possible, ideally. So you can, changes in velocity, I don't know if I mentioned this, I really should have. Changes in velocity, we just call it delta V. And that's literally what that means, change in your velocity. In the case of a rocket, the delta V of the rocket is just, if you have a rocket and it's full of propellant, and it's going 0 meters per second in the void of space, and you fire it, and it speeds up, and it keeps speeding up until it runs out of gas, it will continue flying at some velocity, and whatever that is, was the rocket's delta V. So, cadets, is this all making sense?
I have a really, this is going to be old man question.
Yes.
Why aren't there two rockets facing opposite directions to slow down or speed up?
To slow down, because...
Why is there not an engine?
Why do you have an engine
the
on the
front
front?
and the back?
Yes! I mean, I know it's stupid. It's got to be stupid, right?
Yeah, well, because you can just turn the rocket around.
Flip.
You can just flip the rocket around. So the rocket's facing one direction. You can, what you do, normally, here we go. You have a rocket. We haven't talked about torque yet, but you can use smaller rockets.
I was going to say that. So in crazy Kerbal land, I'm sure there are people doing stuff like this.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you can use smaller rockets on your rocket to flip your rocket around.
And that's basically what RCS is. The,
Yeah.
the little
Reaction,
Gotcha.
my eraser is really
Gotcha.
temperamental.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Photoshop doesn't like me to erase things, but that's okay. Yeah, that's reaction control system.
Just trying to see if there's any questions in the chat.
Probably not.
Somebody should make a game out of this. I agree.
Yeah, totally.
No, I think we're good.
Awesome. All right. So, go to space, you need to go fast. To go far in space, you need to go even faster. We need to maximize the degree to which our rocket can change its velocity. So how do we do that? How do we make sure the delta V is high as possible? Well, that is what this guy figured out. This is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He is your god. He discovered the rocket equation, which tells you how fast a rocket can ultimately go, starting from 0.
But what time frame was that?
This was, when did he figure this out? This was in the 1800s, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So way before, like,
Way before rockets were a thing. This was back when, what? Yeah, Tsiolkovsky.
Very quickly looking it up. 1897.
1897, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Close to the turn of the century. And then Robert Goddard, who invented the first liquid propellant rocket, independently figured it out.
Hmm.
He didn't know about Tsiolkovsky's discovery because it was all in Russian and he didn't speak Russian. And there was no translation or internet back then, so he figured it out too. But Tsiolkovsky gets the credit because he figured it out first. So this equation tells you how fast a rocket can ultimately get going, given like what it looks like. Yes.
There weren't 1800s rockets, right?
I mean, there were fireworks.
What was he using this equation for?
He was trying to figure out how to get to space.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
so he was like, we want to do this. We don't even have the tech.
We don't even have the technology, but like if you had something that could do this, and they did. I mean, they had rockets. Like you had gunpowder. You could put something in gunpowder in a can with a nozzle and.
How big of a firework do you need?
Yeah. How many fireworks do you need to go fast enough to get to the moon or something? Yeah.
And he's also credited as like the founder of
He's
astronauts.
like the father of rocketry.
Yeah.
The father of rocket science, basically, is often what he's called. Yeah, him, and then later Herman Oberth and Goddard.
Goddard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this equation, basically, he figured out that the maximum speed of your rocket only cares about two things. There are two things that matter. One is the rocket's exhaust velocity, which is how fast the fast stuff was going when it left your rocket. How much of it was going out of the rocket doesn't matter. How much force it was applying to the rocket doesn't matter. All that matters is how fast it was moving relative to the rocket. So if you can make your propellant go really fast, that will make your delta V go up. You will eventually attain a higher speed by making your propellant go fast. The second thing it cares about is the rocket's mass ratio, which is this little picture down here. The mass of the rocket when it is full of propellant divided by the mass of the rocket when it is finally empty. And you take the natural logarithm of that, and then that goes in your delta V. And this should be pretty intuitive. Like, here's a little picture of here's a rocket with a high mass ratio, and it is mostly fuel. Here's a rocket with a low mass ratio. There's not much fuel in it. And if these two engines, they light up at the same time, and they burn the same amount of fuel per second, and they accelerate at the same rate, well, this one runs out of fuel first and stops accelerating, and the other one keeps going and eventually gets to a higher speed. So the fraction of your rocket that is fuel means you will eventually go faster. So if you want to make a rocket go as fast as possible, make a large portion of it fuel, make the fuel go really fast. Which ultimately means add more fuel tanks and use a fancier engine. Importantly, not a higher thrust engine. This is a little counterintuitive, but thrust, like how hard the rocket can push, has nothing to do with how fast it can eventually go. Like here on Earth, fast things tend to have like big powerful engines, and that's because we're constantly fighting drag. Where there's friction with the ground, there's friction with the air, and the harder you can push, the faster you can go. But in space, none of that friction. There's nothing to slow you down, and so you can take your time building up velocity over a long time, and ultimately your thrust doesn't matter. This is kind of where the booster memes come from. Like add more boosters. Solid rocket booster is a little bit different because they're also a fuel tank. Yeah, but sometimes newbies will start playing KSP and go, oh, my rocket's not making it to orbit. Like, I need to put more engines on it to go faster. And ironically, that ends up slowing you down. For a number of reasons. Is that all making sense? Questions? Questions?
Why doesn't adding more engines make you go faster?
Why doesn't adding more engines make you go faster? We'll talk about that when you get to thrust to weight ratio. Your top speed is reduced. All things being equal, if you add more engines, your final top speed will be lower, but you will get to that top speed quicker.
Gotcha.
So,
Because you're adding more mass.
yeah, you're adding more mass to your rocket. We'll get into it when we talk about thrust to weight ratio.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here these two little graphs is like your exhaust velocity is arguably more important for making the rocket have more delta V because it's just a one-to-one proportional thing. If you make the exhaust go faster, then your delta V will go up, just one-to-one. That's great. But your mass ratio is a little different. You'll find that if you start sticking fuel tanks on your rocket, at first it makes a big difference. You have more fuel, you can burn for longer, you end up reaching a higher speed, great. But the more tanks you add, the more massive your rocket becomes. And the more slowly it initially accelerates. So let's get rid of some of this stuff. And you run into this problem here, which is sometimes called the tyranny of the rocket equation. So let's say you have, I promised there would be no math, but there maybe is a little bit of math.
You've been showing math like crazy.
So let's say you have a rocket that's going 0 meters per second, you have one fuel tank on it, and you burn through the fuel tank and you end up going 10 meters per second. Well, it's not a very good rocket, but okay. It's a bottle rocket, whatever. And you want it to go faster. Okay, well, add another fuel tank. So you double the amount of fuel. Well, by the time you finish burning the first tank now, you're still pushing the mass of the second tank that you added. So you're not going to speed up to 10 meters per second. You're only going to speed up to, I don't know, 7, something like that. And then you go, okay, well, now I've emptied that tank. Now I should be able to speed up another 10 meters per second, but not so fast because you're still carrying the mass of the empty tank. And with each additional tank that you add, it gets worse and worse and worse. So with 3 tanks, you know, you're pushing 2 tanks with the first tank, and then you're pushing 1 extra tank and 2 empty tanks, or an empty tank with the second tank, and then you're pushing 3 empty tanks with the third tank. And double the fuel does not mean double the delta V. And if I were to continue these examples like further on down, and have more rockets down here, and draw a curve through them, that curve would end up being this curve there, which is the natural logarithm. So basically just diminishing returns. For any given stage of your rocket, you're going to add fuel tanks until it just kind of starts hurting you, and then you're going to stop. Yeah, so here's your Drake meme. You know, thrust, don't worry about thrust, but exhaust velocity is where it's at. And then like your mass ratio is important, but it doesn't have a. Darren.
Excuse me. Please put your phone away in class.
Sorry to go to.
Remove you from the theater.
I'm trying to look at chat. I want to know if they're. I know they are.
Yeah. I mean, your mass ratios. I don't want to say it's not as important as the exhaust velocity. It's differently important. It's generally not going to vary by that much, whereas exhaust velocity can vary by a huge margin. So the tyranny of the rocket equation. I hope that makes sense. We can get into how exhaust velocity is important. Like, this is something that I didn't first get a long time ago. Like, why is it the velocity? Why can't I just add more thrust? Why doesn't thrust help me go faster? Why does it matter how much, you know, mass I'm pushing at a given time? And so I came up with this little example, and I'm sorry that it's in freedom units, but it's just what I knew off the top of my head. So imagine if you had an astronaut who's like a Major League Baseball pitcher, and people in Seattle know this. This is why I use this example. And a Major League pitcher can throw a fastball at about 90 miles per hour. But how fast could a Major League pitcher throw 100 baseballs all at once? And I did the math, and if it's the same impulse, he can throw it at about 9 miles per hour, about a tenth as fast. So if you had a Major League pitcher astronaut who's trying to get somewhere, and he had a bag of 100 baseballs, he could throw it away from himself all at once at 9 miles per hour and be pushed back and at, I don't know, 2 miles per hour. Let's make up a number. It depends on how heavy he is. Or, I mean, he could do that, and he would accelerate pretty quickly. Like, that's a lot of thrust. If you're floating in space, you have a bag of 100 baseballs, and you chuck it away from you, it's like jumping, you know, like you push away from it really fast. Or he could hold on to 99 of the baseballs and throw one at a time as fast as he can at 90 miles per hour. And he won't speed up very much because he only threw 1 baseball. And he's still holding on to 99 baseballs, so he's much heavier, so he doesn't speed up very much. But remember, every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. So he's invested some of the energy of that throw into the 99 remaining baseballs that he's holding. And now they're all moving a little bit faster. And he does it again, and does it again, and does it again. And he'll speed up slowly, right? Until eventually you'll reach this situation where you have this comparison between, fast. I don't know how fast. I think I tried to do the math, and I was coming up with something like 14 meters per second or something like that.
This reminds me of the...
I don't know.
The
math was getting a little...
Discord user Josh made a mod that's an engine that just...
Shoots bricks.
Shoots bricks.
Yeah.
And so...
It's a Nerf gun that shoots bricks. Exactly the same thing. If his Nerf gun had the same thrust power, but instead of firing 1 brick, it fired like a quarter of a brick, like but 4 times as many quarter bricks.
Yeah.
It could get to higher speeds. It would have a higher exhaust velocity. So, so these two situations are obviously different. You have a bag of 100 baseballs going 9 miles per hour one way, and the astronaut going 2 miles per hour the other way, versus the same 100 baseballs going almost 100 miles per hour away from the astronaut, and the astronaut going some significantly higher speed in the opposite direction at the end of the day. But it took him longer to get to that speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all things being equal, if you have two similar engines, in this case, the engine is the astronaut's arm, and the astronaut's arm can only apply so many, newtons of force into each, whatever he's throwing. If the astronaut wisely uses his muscle power to throw small bits of material as fast as he can, then at the end of the day, his exhaust velocity will be a bit higher, and he'll eventually attain a higher speed. So, if you're an astronaut ever, and you find yourself trapped in space, and you have a bag of 100 baseballs, and you need to get somewhere because your life depends on it, throw them one at a time.
In this unlikely scenario.
Yeah, in this unlikely scenario, throw things one at a time. I wonder if it would work on like an ice skating rink. Should
does
try it
feel-
out.
It feels like something that would happen in
Like
a
holding a
Gravity-esque
bunch of-
movie.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah, it
imagine,
would.
Like Sandra Bullock,
It
like
would.
throwing baseballs.
It's
Yeah.
talks like this that make Mythbusters a thing, right?
Yeah.
They go like, hey,
Yeah.
and sort of-
I remember a physics lesson from like 7th grade, and they were like, there's an astronaut, and he's trapped in space, and he has to get back to his space station, and he has a backpack. How is he going to get there? And you have to like push off with the backpack. But it's better if he like throws parts out of the backpack one at a time. Yeah, so that's why exhaust velocity matters. Okay, great. So, to go to space, you need to go fast. To go as fast as possible, you need to make your exhaust go fast, and you need to add more fuel tanks. To make your exhaust go fast, you need to use a fancy engine. So what is a fancy engine? What makes an engine fancy, and how do I know which engines are fancy?
It's
Weird.
what everybody is always arguing about, like
Yeah.
preference over different types of engines
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
What makes an engine? What makes some engines fancier than others? That brings us to specific impulse, which is very hard to explain.
Chad just said that the astronaut would need to be ambidextrous, or else he'd start spinning.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. You have
You'd
to
have
throw
to be
one
doing-
baseball, and then you'd flip over backwards a little
Yeah.
bit, and then you'd have to like turn around and like you'd have to overhand, underhand.
Yeah.
Have to alternate between overhand and underhand. Yeah. Or be very good at like
Doing both,
pushing
yes,
them from
pushing
your
chest.
yeah. Your center of gravity is about at your pelvis. So
Okay.
if you have a rocket engine, hold it there. So let's see. Yeah, so ISP. So ISP is short for specific impulse.
What is short for what?
Specific impulse.
Well, what's it called?
ISP. So this is scientific notation. So
Oh.
specific impulse is impulse specifically.
Oh, got it.
And it is really hard to explain, but it's how much impulse a rocket engine can apply to the vehicle it's attached to or itself per kilogram of propellant that it consumes. It's the efficiency with which it can turn propellant into thrust over time.
It's kind of like miles per gallon.
It's like miles per
Yeah.
gallon. It is. Yeah. And
How much power you're getting out of it?
for reasons that are confusing to explain and take math to explain, it's measured in seconds, like of time,
Of course.
which is weird. And you might naively ask, like, is that how long the engine can run for? Anth was just asking me this today. He was asking, like, you have two engines, and they're similar, like, is the ISP like the burn time? It's related to the burn time. Depending on how carefully you ask the question, that is the answer. But basically, it's miles per gallon. It's your gas mileage, or for people who don't use American units, it's your petrol kilometerage. Yeah, it's your fuel economy.
Furloughs per hour.
Furloughs per yeah. It's your fuel economy.
Yeah.
And there's Anth right there. Hi.
Hey, Andy. Sorry.
Say hi, Anth. Say hi to
He
chat.
knows all this stuff. He's just coming in to make fun of me.
Yeah.
Go down a little.
Hello,
bit.
everybody. Anthea.
There it is.
There he is.
Sit on him. Sit in for a minute.
All right.
You were just mentioned.
Yeah, you were just
wow.
mentioned.
Yeah, we're talking about ISP.
Welcome to KSP school, Rocket School.
All right.
We're talking about ISP. But ISP for your purposes right now, it is directly proportional to exhaust velocity. In the case of rocket engines specifically, no pun intended, it's directly proportional to the exhaust velocity by a factor of g, by a factor of 9.81. So if you take the exhaust velocity and you divide it by the force of gravity, you will get the ISP in seconds. And for right now, it's basically two different ways of measuring the same thing. It's like Fahrenheit and Celsius. So if a rocket has higher ISP, that means that the stuff that's shooting out of it is moving more quickly, all things being equal. And different engines have different ISPs. And in the game, I don't know if I have the game open right now. Let's see. Yeah, here we go.
Graphic.
What was that graphic?
Oh, what was that?
But yeah, so
one
like
fancy thing about the streams.
yeah, so different engines have different ISPs. So like here's the Reliant, and it has a ISP at 1 atmosphere of 260 seconds, and in vacuum of 305. And if we go over here to the Swivel, it's 280 seconds in atmosphere and 320 in vacuum. You'll see all these numbers. Let's go back to the lecture slide. Yeah, so well, like why do different engines have different ISPs? Like why wouldn't you just want them to be as high as possible? Just make the ISP higher. This gets into like specifics of how rocket engines are designed and how they physically work, but basically all rocket engines are happier in a vacuum. All rocket engines have higher ISP when there's nothing around. Basically because the air pressure at sea level will like push into the nozzle and slow down the propellant, right? So if there's nothing in the way, the rocket engine is going to work better. And the problem is, if you optimize a rocket engine to work really, really well in a vacuum, it won't work really well in an atmosphere.
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
So is it different types of rockets, like when you're taking off versus?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. So some engines work great in vacuum, and in an atmosphere they work really, really badly, and in real life some of them would probably even blow up if you tried to fire them in an atmosphere because of something called flow separation. But some engines, what you can do is you can sacrifice its ability to work in a vacuum. You can sacrifice your vacuum ISP, and that will improve your sea level ISP. So when you do that, you get a booster engine. And that's why some of the engines in the game are called boosters. And those are the engines that are happy when they're on the ground. But as you go higher and as you go through the upper atmosphere, the air gets thinner. It would be better to be using an orbital engine, because once you get up here, like the orbital deep space engines or the sustainer engines are going to be a lot happier up there.
And in the game, they're labeled as such.
They're labeled as such. Yeah. Boosters, sustainers, orbital, and deep space. So that is why different rocket engines have different ISPs. One of the reasons. Are there any questions? Where do we go from here? Is everyone's brain fried yet?
The entire chat is focused on the units.
Oh.
That's all everybody's
Focused on what?
Units of measurement.
The units of measurement?
That's all everybody's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone's... what do I have? There's stuff wrong? Freedom! Freedom! Yeah, so different engines have different ISPs. Yeah.
And I apologize, this isn't Kerbal kind of thing. Are just some types of rockets and fuel more cost effective than others in that sense? Or some just like, hey, this is so expensive to use this.
Cost effectiveness is like a whole other kind of story. A lot of modern rockets are moving to methalox fuel, and in the game, methalox is what is the kind of standard rocket fuel. It's liquid methane and liquid oxygen. There are other options, right? There's kerosene and liquid oxygen. There's alcohol and liquid oxygen. I think it was the V2 ran alcohol, ethanol. The highest performance chemical fuel, which isn't in KSP, actually I might be wrong about this, but it's hydrolox. So liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The trouble with liquid hydrogen is that in order to be a liquid, it has to be very close to absolute zero. So it has to be kept extremely cold, and it can't be kept up next
to a rocket, for example?
well, like if you have a rocket tank and half of it's liquid hydrogen to burn and half of it is the liquid oxygen to burn it, The liquid oxygen is a liquid at like 150 or 180 Kelvin or something, I don't remember, whereas the hydrogen is a liquid at like 3 Kelvin. And if they're touching, it'll freeze the oxygen, and you have to insulate the hydrogen is a nightmare to deal with. But because the exhaust products are smaller, they're smaller, the molecules that are shooting out of it is just water instead of water and carbon dioxide. It's like having smaller baseballs thrown faster. And so Hydrolox propellant can go much faster, and that gets you higher ISP. So there are engines in the game that are based on real-life engines. So like the brass section, the tuba, and the trumpet, they're based on an engine called the RL10, which is a Hydrolox engine. It's like 460 seconds of ISP or something. Really impressive. And it was just launched on the Vulcan, on the Centaur upper stage. So yeah, so there's kind of a...
There's a question about aerospikes.
Aerospikes, yeah.
Is that relevant to this discussion?
Kind of.
Okay.
So I said before, like, you know, some rocket engines are happier in vacuum and other ones are happier on the surface. Aerospikes have, I don't want to get into like the details of how they work.
Just to define what
Yeah, but they're an inverted rocket nozzle, and you have the combustion all happening up here, and the propellant is blasted out down this way, and the air pressure kind of confines the propellant onto the surface of the spike, so that by the time it leaves the spike, it's going straight back. And then as you go up through the atmosphere and the air pressure becomes weaker, it's not quite as confined, but it's still going directly back. And aerospikes have this property where they maintain their ISP kind of at all altitudes. So you might ask, like, well, why don't we just use those all the time if they're great? 2 reasons. Their vacuum ISP is not quite as good as a traditional, this is called a de Lavelle nozzle, a traditional nozzle that is like optimized for vacuum. And also they have cooling problems, because like a normal rocket engine, that big bell has a lot of surface area, and surface area helps you cool down. But an aerospike is very small, and its surface area is limited, and so it gets really, really hot, and it's hard to cool that thing. And so,
how do we decide which ones we use in the game? Is that like a Tristan? Is that
yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Depending on how he balances the engines.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will force you to pick some over another.
There's also the ones with the expanding.
Yeah, yeah,
I
expanding.
don't know what it's called.
Yeah, there's a, well, in the case of the trumpet and the tuba, the brass section, the expanding nozzle is really, it's really there to like, I should really focus in on this. Ah.
And so the nozzle extends.
Yeah, the nozzle, these parts of the nozzle are pushed out until it forms like a super nozzle.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's more for like compactness. It helps the engine fit in a smaller space. There are also these nozzles that are like double. They're like 2 rings like that. Mm-hmm. And this is the one that works at low altitude, and the air pressure forms these like vortices in here so that you don't get like flow separation instabilities. And then once you get up higher, like this is the nozzle that starts working. But none of those are in the game. It's kind of an experimental sort of thing.
And the aerospike in the game is the dart.
The dart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that's it. I don't think there's any other
Yeah.
major questions.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I said before, how your mass ratio doesn't really change a lot because there's this sort of sweet spot for like every single rocket, but your exhaust velocity can change enormously, and the same is true for ISP. So engines really run the gamut in terms of their ISP. So this is sort of like the hierarchy, I guess, of engines. Sort of. There really should be another axis to this graph. But over on one end, you have the dumb engines, and those are your solid rocket boosters and the puff, which no one likes, and your RCS. And then, you know, your mainsail, your swivel, your Reliant, which get 300s, 400 seconds. Getting fancier, you get to your nuclear engines, your Nerve and your Swerve, which get like 800, and then 1450, you know, getting crazy. Ion drives get up to like 4,000 seconds. The nuclear pulse engine, when we get into further on in the game, has thousands of seconds of ISP. I don't know exactly which one is which. It depends on the size of it. And then, you know, later on, towards the end game, you get the ultra spicy mega ultra ghost pepper spicy physics, and the data whisk. I don't remember what it is. It's hundreds of thousands of seconds.
It's called the ghost pepper.
Ghost pepper spicy.
Yeah.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of seconds of ISP, like almost a million seconds. It's shooting ions at fractions of light speed.
Just
What?
the art the art that Pope has drawn is not concept art. Don't think that the engines in the game will.
Oh
actually look
no,
like
I
this.
drew this just randomly from memory. Don't
Yes.
worry
There
about
are
it.
people that are like, oh my gosh, leaks.
No, yeah.
This is Pope trying to explain things to Darren. Art,
Yeah.
not,
Yeah. I literally drew this from memory. I have no idea. I
Pope
remember it's
does
a thing.
do concept art. For
I
the game,
do.
but this is not.
Is not it.
You don't design parts though.
No.
That's a Chris thing.
Yeah, it's a Chris thing, and yeah, it's kind of a. Teams don't need concept art for the
Sure.
engines in this game. They're kind of
Yeah.
well explored. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So now that I've spent like the past hour or something telling you that thrust doesn't matter and that you shouldn't worry about it, I'm going to tell you how much it matters and why you should worry about it. So let's talk about thrust to weight ratio. So like, if you have any familiarity with rockets, it's pretty obvious that they have lots of giant fiery engines that are loud and noisy, and thrust is very important. So why do you keep telling me that thrust doesn't matter? Well, it is important for really one thing, which is getting off the ground. Right? If you have, say, an ion engine with 4,000 seconds of ISP and it's super duper efficient, that's great, but it only has what, fractions of a newton of thrust. It can barely lift itself. It probably can't even lift itself off the pad. So you're going to sit there and burn through all of your fuel very slowly and not go anywhere. So at the end of the day, you do need some amount of thrust to actually get moving. And if delta V is probably the most important stat that you need to consider in your rockets, thrust to weight ratio is probably the second most important stat. So your thrust to weight ratio is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ratio of your thrust to your weight, to the rocket's weight. So your rocket weighs so many tons, and it has so many tons of thrust force. And if the tons of thrust is not bigger than the tons of weight, then your rocket will not move. Yeah, I know. Whoops. Oh no, I broke Photoshop. Where'd it go?
See, so
There we go.
Why you pick that? So that's kind of the beauty of it all, right? Like
Yeah.
for all of us, like, we try this.
Yeah.
You hit the button, and it doesn't go right, and then you try it.
You try it
do a
again.
little bit different. I mean, like, how, if you're learning this stuff in school, do they explain that without having a good visualization, right?
They use KSP1.
They use KSP1 to do it. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Is that true, chat? Did you guys get KSP in college and stuff like
Man.
that? That's awesome.
I mean, there's other tools.
Yeah.
And I think that they would probably,
Excuse me.
bottle rocket and strap a weight
Yeah.
to it, and that
Yeah.
basically is what
Yeah.
would show the.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. They have like my kid has a after school thing where they build
Yeah.
launches. So
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah, so thrust weight ratio is important for getting off the ground. There's a related term called your thrust to mass ratio, and that's just defined as your thrust to weight ratio sitting on the surface of Kerbal in a vacuum. And that's because the definition of mass is like how much something weighs on the surface of the Earth. Yeah. So before I get into why that's important, here's another reason why you don't want high thrust. Before we move on to why you want thrust, here's a reason why you don't want thrust. So you'll notice that if you want to make the thrust to weight ratio of a rocket higher, all things being equal, you need to make the engines bigger relative to the rest of the rocket, generally speaking. And if you do that, well, that just means that more of the percentage of your rocket is not propellant. And that's your mass ratio. So the more push your rocket has, the less of a fraction of propellant it must be.
Why is it what? I hate when I ask dumb stuff here to make fun of me.
Do
Why
it.
is it about mass rather than weight?
Mass rather than weight? Because mass is ultimately what has momentum. Weight is the force that a massive object exerts on the surface of another object when it's being attracted by gravity.
Mass is the stuff.
Mass is the
inside.
stuff, how much stuff there is.
Yeah.
What?
Nothing. I asked Anthony that was a dumb question. He just shook his head.
No.
I think the difference between mass and weight is unintuitive.
Yeah, it is not quite intuitive, but there's another example further on, but we'll get into that. But yeah, like these rockets pretty obviously, like, yeah, the one on the right is going to accelerate a lot faster. It's probably going to shoot off the ground a lot faster, but it's also not going to go as far. You know, if there weren't gravity holding it down, right? This one on the left, it would be very, very happy in a vacuum where there's nothing to stop it because it can take its time speeding up and get to a higher delta V. So, but let's get to what thrust is really useful for, and that's overcoming something called gravity drag. Basically just getting off the ground. So if you figure out your thrust weight ratio, you take your thrust, you divide it by your weight, you're going to get some number. And if the number is lower than 1, that means that your engines have less thrust than the force of gravity on your rocket, and you're not going to move. If it's exactly 1, that means that your engines have just as much thrusting force as gravity pulling you down. And the two forces just cancel out. And when forces cancel out, nothing happens.
Give me an example of that
Still don't move.
in the game. Like, where would I see that? Is that when I'm taking off? And then
Yeah, actually, let's try it.
Yes.
Let's
Yes.
try it.
I wanna see
Let's see if I can make a rocket
example.
with a thrust weight ratio of exact. Try this one, and I'll just do the thrust limiter. All right. So this is 1.63, 0.78. How close can I get? 1.0. 1.01?
Where are you-
0.98. There we go. All right. So I made a rocket with a thrust weight ratio of 0.98, which is very close to 1. And hopefully that wasn't in vacuum. Oh, I wonder if I broke it. Let's try it. Hang on.
You want to open up the engineer's report?
Yeah, I'm going to make sure. Yeah, it's in there. It's in there. Atmosphere affects your thrust. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But yeah, this is really cool to demonstrate if I can get it right. Yeah, 0.49. Okay. So let's. Yeah, I need more. It may not. It may never go over 1 because it's a Terrier.
On the far side?
Yeah, you can see the thrust
0.82,
rate, the
yeah,
first thing
okay.
in the assembly statistics.
Got it?
Yeah.
Oh, thrust weight, got it.
Yeah, let's use a big.
Yep,
We
yep,
need
yep.
to use a bigger engine. Whoops.
Yep.
Use a bigger engine, bring down the thrust.
Yep.
Yeah, this is a much bigger engine, so we really need to bring down the thrust.
Yep.
All right. 0.991, there we go, in atmosphere. And that should agree with this. See, that's 1.3, but if we set to Kerbal atmosphere, yeah, 0.99. Okay, great. So if we launch this guy, I'll just lock it vertical, fire the engine, there. So the thrust is thrusting as hard as it can. Gravity's pulling it down. Now it's starting to move up. Why?
I have no idea. Just because is it just burning everything it's got?
Yeah, well, it's getting lighter.
Oh.
So the rocket's getting lighter, propellant is leaving the rocket, which means the weight is decreasing, but the thrust stays the same. So it's
Oh, that's a good example.
thrust to weight ratio
Oh,
increases.
Pope, you explained it perfectly.
There you go.
Got it.
So that's how that works.
Yeah, there's a lot of systems like that in the game where
Yeah.
you're like, why is it doing this? And it's because you're burning fuel, and that brings the mass down.
Right. We'll talk about how thrust weight ratio happens over the course of the flight. But anyway, so if we can tab back to the
Oh yeah.
whiteboard. Oh, what? There's
Oh.
leaks.
Mm.
That's fine. Yeah, so if your thrust weight ratio is 1 on the surface of Kerbal, that means 0% of your thrust matters. Right? Just like the first second of that flight, I was sitting there not going anywhere. I was burning fuel basically for no reason. But if your thrust weight ratio is 1.1, then 9% of your thrust matters. 9% of your thrust will actually accelerate you. Because this 1 over here is just, that's what's being eaten by gravity, and only this 0.1 remains. And so that's what's accelerating me. And if you make the thrust weight ratio a little bit higher, you go up to 1.2, then 16% of your thrust matters. 1.3, 23%, and so on. And if you graph that, you'll end up with something like this. So on Kerbin, here's your thrust-weight ratio down at the bottom. If you keep making it higher, over here on the y-axis, that's how much of your thrust is accelerating you. And you can see that if it's lower than 1, nothing's happening. If it's 1, still nothing's happening. But pretty quickly, once you get up to 1.5, suddenly 33% of your thrust is accelerating you. You're accelerating upwards at a third the rate that you would be if gravity wasn't there. You can keep making your thrust-weight ratio higher, keep adding more engines, and you'll accelerate faster. But you see that there is also this diminishing returns kind of thing going on. That once you get up to 3 or 4, you don't need to make the thrust-weight ratio higher than that. You're already going to space, right? Gravity has been defeated at this point. You're going up. What?
You showed your Slack.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Desktop. That's what I seen all over
There's
Slack
nothing.
channels.
There's nothing on it. They're just looking good.
Yeah. So that's So your thrust weight ratio really never needs to be higher than 3 or 4. I mean 3 or 4 is crazy. Also 4Gs hurt. Have you ever pulled 4Gs or 5Gs like on a roller coaster or on one of those spinny things like?
Well, the Kerbals can survive it.
The Kerbals can survive. They can take like 15 Gs or something. Something obscene.
Something, yeah.
Yeah. 4 or 5 G. Nice. I saw what you did there. You're waiting for that the whole time. All right. So that's how your thrust to weight ratio basically works. But anyway, here was the example I had of the difference between thrust to weight ratio and thrust to mass ratio, like the difference between weight and mass. So I'm zoomed in really too far, aren't I? I need to make sure that you guys can see this. Okay, so here you have one rocket put in 2 different situations, one on the surface of the Mun and one on the surface of Kerbin. And the thing about gravity is it really doesn't care if you try to go sideways. It only wants to stop you from going up. It's pulling down. So if you were to put this rocket on wheels and like shoot it sideways on the Mun and on Kerbin, it would accelerate at the same rate, both on the Mun and on Kerbin, discounting things like atmospheric drag and friction and stuff. Spherical cows in a vacuum. So if you have a rocket with a thrust to mass ratio of 1.5, then on Kerbin, or the Mun, if it's firing sideways, it's going to accelerate at about 15 meters per second every second. Because a G is about 10 meters per second, so 15. So after 1 second it's going 15 meters per second, 2 seconds it's going 30, and 45, 60, and so on. But if you tip the same rocket up and you fire them up, the one on Kerbin is going to accelerate upward much more slowly, because 10 meters per second of that 15 meter per second acceleration is just getting eaten away by gravity, leaving only 5. So it accelerates at 5, 10, 15. Whereas the one on the Mun is nowhere near as constrained, because the Mun's gravity is only 1/6 of what it is on Kerbin. And I did try to do the math here, and it turns out that on the Mun, a rocket with a thrust to mass ratio of 1.5 has a thrust to weight ratio of 9. So it's not a really, that doesn't mean that your Kerbals are going to feel 9 Gs just because they're on the Mun. They're still going to feel 1.5 Gs, but they have a thrust to weight ratio of 9, and that just means that the Mun just can't even hold on to them anymore. They're just going so fast. So they accelerated 89% of what their acceleration would be if there was no Mun there. And hopefully that kind of shows an intuitive comparison of like the difference between mass and weight. Ultimately, what this means, and you can tell by the comparison, is that you really don't want to be going up, especially if you're on a on a body that has high gravity like Kerbin or Tylo. Going up means gravity's constantly taxing you.
Right, and they got that kind of in the tutorial, right? They
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gravity's turn. Gravity's constantly taxing you. It's saying, hey, every second you spend fighting me, I'm going to charge you 10 meters per second from your delta V. You lose 10 meters per second of delta V every second that you try to go up.
And that's true for all the planets in the system.
Yeah, but different planets charge you different amounts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the Mun, it's It's
not,
what?
Not as big a deal.
It's not as big a deal. On the Mun, it's 1.6 meters per second every second.
Right.
Yeah, and on Minmus, it's even less. And on Gilly, it's basically nothing. And on Joule, it's a lot. I don't know what it is, but it's a lot. So you want to get off the pad and get going as quick as you can, and then start going sideways. Because like in the Newton's cannon example, right, the thing that keeps you in orbit is the fact that you're going sideways. And you only really go up at all to get out of the air, because air is a problem. Remember, air is choking your. It's not a problem for humans, but it's a problem for rocket engines. Yeah, like it's reducing the ISP of your engines, and it's going to slow you down due to drag. This is another thing we need to worry about. Yet another reason why your thrust should not be as high as possible. So here are two rockets, one with a high thrust-to-weight ratio, one with a low thrust-to-weight ratio. What I'm seeing is never what you're seeing.
So
Okay.
when you show, like, you're probably gonna get to, when you show
Yeah.
those colors,
Mhm.
is that different?
That's the atmosphere.
That's
thickness.
different levels of.
Yeah, so down low, the atmosphere is very dense,
Right.
and as you go up, it fades away.
And in the game, there's that atmosphere.
You have the atmosphere indicator
you
that
see
shows the
those
same
colors.
thing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the drag equation, and you don't need to know the whole thing or what all the bits are. But what's really important about it and what's really nasty about it is this square right here. Drag, the force of drag increases with the square of your velocity. So if you, and the force of drag is opposite the direction of your motion. The force of drag is like yet another tax. If you double your velocity, you quadruple the drag on you. You quadruple the drag force. If you triple your velocity, you nonuple the drag force because it's velocity squared.
So it's not all about just going massively as fast as possible then? There's like an
No.
optimum.
Well, that's the problem
Yeah.
that people have been running into now that we added reentry.
Add reentry
is
heating.
that We're going too fast
Yeah.
on takeoff that they actually were running into
Yeah.
reentry heating,
Yeah, reentry heating is a sort
Not
of a different thing. but-
entering.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. But basically what this means is like, if you leave the pad going really fast, you're making drag more powerful. You make drag exponentially more powerful the faster you leave the pad. So you kind of want to sneak past it. If you leave the pad at, a thrust-to-weight ratio of 2 or 3 or something like that, you'll punch into the atmosphere, and it's going to be doing its best to stop you. And ultimately what that means is that you're kind of wasting fuel fighting drag that you otherwise wouldn't have to if you weren't going as fast. So if you leave the pad at a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.5 or 1.3, then you'll leave the pad slowly, and then by the time, drag still happens, you can't avoid it, but it's going to be a lot weaker. And then by the time you really start going fast, you'll be in a position where you're up above the dense air, and then, drag is not, it's like, hey, wait for me, and, oops, like, yeah, bye. Like, once you kind of snuck past the drag monster,
I've
then you
noticed
can
that when we're
power
going and you seem like your fuel's real low, but also you get up there and then your fuel lasts forever.
Yeah, exactly. Once you're out of the atmosphere, you get to keep all the delta V that's in your rocket until you burn it. Whereas drag and gravity are constantly slowing you down. So if you boil all of this down, again, you can do some scary calculus, but if you boil this whole screen down, your ideal thrust-to-weight ratio on the surface of Kerbin is going to be about 1.5. Some would argue it should even be lower, like 1.3. For reference, Starship has a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.5. The Saturn V that went to the moon, I think, had like 1.22 or something. Very low. And then there's a Russian rocket, I think the Proton, that has 1.6, which is a little high. On airless bodies, like the Mun or Tylo, it may do to have a little bit of a higher thrust-to-weight ratio, because if there's no air, there's no drag. So the only thing that's going to be slowing you down is gravity loss, and a little bit more thrust will help you avoid that gravity loss. So maybe on Tylo, air up to like 1.7-ish. Yeah. So
The 1.5 is a good.
1.5 is a good rule of thumb, pretty much everywhere. Yeah. And what that means is, like, if you're going to land on the moon, you know, you don't need a thrust to mass ratio of 1 or 1.5,
Yeah.
like, because your thrust to weight ratio is going to be enormous. You can make a Mun lander that can't even move on Kerbin. You know, the Mun lander could sit on Kerbin and burn through all of its fuel and not move at all, but on the Mun it's going to be perfectly happy because the Mun's gravity is very weak and it's easy to overpower it. Okay, so we're getting kind of close to the end. This is close to the end of Rocket Science 101. Any big questions? Are our brains fried?
I mean, I've seen demos of that last part for sure. That's
Yeah.
like the tutorials. Like, I think I understand that the most.
Yeah. Oh, I wrote some stuff down up here.
Explain a little bit more about like the slowing down part when you, like we kind of talked about at the beginning. So we get, it's all just about turnaround, slowing down,
Mhm.
stopping on the floor. How much does that get figured out for you versus how much do you have to figure out?
A lot of it's well. Let's do the next slide and then we'll. All right. So here's the like. Okay, but like how? Like
Okay, yeah.
here's what I would call like a typical launch.
Yeah.
You know. So on the pad. You know, thrust away, and your rocket may not have this many stages. To get into Kerbin orbit, you don't need 4 stages. You can do it in 1. Yeah, but typically you start off with a booster engine, which is really dumb, but happy in atmosphere. Thrust weight ratio of 1.5, and as you speed up, you end up like having more thrust than you need, right? Because when you're the goal here is to get to orbit. Right? It's to go sideways. So you start off going up slowly and then curving over and going sideways as fast as you can. And when you're picking up speed sideways, gravity's not fighting that. Gravity doesn't care if you go sideways. And so the thrust to weight ratio you need, or thrust to mass ratio you need to go sideways and pick up speed to get into orbit, it is really, really low. It can be below 1 on your upper stages. You can keep it at 1 for safety in case you mess up, which I do often. So you're kind of like your necessary thrust to weight ratio is like it decreases over the course of the flight. Yeah.
So if gravity's not carrying it, it's going sideways,
Mhm.
why do we go straight up rather than launching?
Why do we go
at
straight?
1.5?
Well, ooh, good question. Good question. All right. Because of the atmosphere. So here's the surface of the Earth. Here's the thick atmosphere, thinner atmosphere, thinner atmosphere, thinner atmosphere. If you go straight up, at least a little bit, you know, the atmosphere that you're encountering is only that much. But if you tried to launch it like say, an angle, look how much more atmosphere you're encountering.
So
Right.
you wanna find out-
You're running into more stuff.
You
There's-
wanna find like a sweet spot.
Yeah. There's and that sweet spot looks like it looks like that kind of logarithmic curve. It looks like this. Yeah. So the densest air, you want to go straight up to just get out of it. But then as the air gets thinner, you know, like, well, drag is not really much of a problem anymore. So if I can start accelerating sideways because the air is not going to try to stop me. And then as you go higher and higher, that becomes truer and truer. Right? So you kind of start off going up just to get out of the atmosphere and then start going sideways. If Earth didn't have an atmosphere, we would launch rockets. Like, we just mount them on like a thing and go and shoot them that way because we're not fighting the atmosphere. And like when you land on the Mun or land on Tylo and you want to get back home, that's kind of how you launch. You just take off and just pitch over almost 90 degrees immediately and then just start going sideways. Yeah, the only reason we launch rockets up is just to get out of the atmosphere. Yeah, so this is like your kind of typical launch. Are there chat questions? Are they correcting me?
No.
Wow, it's been very
They're
well at that.
very
It's
positive.
like, it's
Okay.
been digging it.
Okay.
I enjoyed the joke. Our alcohol-fueled boosters called boosters.
Wow.
Yes, they are now.
Classic.
If they weren't before, they are now. Yeah.
But no, I don't think there's any major questions.
Yeah. So chat probably knows a lot of this, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure they do.
And you should say that, like just so the chat knows, this isn't like a a chat for them, or a thing for them.
Yeah.
This is, you do this for us anyway, and we're like, hey, we might as well
Yeah,
show it.
we wanted to
Yeah.
show it publicly. Yeah. This is something I was looking up and kind of encountered as I was planning this is acceleration curves
Yeah.
for rockets, which is a big thing that like doesn't really show up in KSP a lot. But it's really interesting, like on the surface of Kerbal or Earth, like on the pad, that's when you need the highest thrust to weight ratio, because when you're moving at 0 meters per second, drag is non-existent, and all that matters is overcoming gravity. So you want to just thrust as hard as you can off the pad, and then you want to start reducing that thrust because drag is increasing. But remember, as your rocket gets lighter, the thrust to weight ratio increases. So your rocket will tend to accelerate more later on in the flight. One of the problems with that, though, is that later on in the flight, you don't need more thrust. You actually kind of could deal with less, right? So you can imagine for any given launch, there's like an ideal thrust to weight ratio or something, like an ideal acceleration that is decreasing over time. But your rocket wants to increase its acceleration over time. And one way that you deal with this is by staging. So you start off like, you start off with like a big powerful first stage and it has a high acceleration, and the acceleration increases and increases and increases, and then you stage it. You cut off that stage and you kick in a second, much less thrusty second stage engine, and its acceleration increases, 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 and then you cut it off and you start another one. And it's sort of like shifting gears in a car. Like as you go faster, like in first gear, the car struggles to get up to speed, and then it's like like this, the RPM gets too high, and they're like, oh, I need to shift again, and you shift into the next gear, and then it's like, oh, now it's struggling again. And as you speed up, you have this kind of step curve. You can look it up on like Google. The Saturn V thrust curve, acceleration curve looked a lot like this. It's sort of like. The space shuttles is really weird, though.
They're talking about using one big stage to burn all the way to orbit.
Yeah,
They're kind of
an
talking
SSTO.
hot staging as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can totally single stage to orbit. That's a thing. We could talk a little bit about how staging works. I didn't really have a slide for like why staging is good.
We're coming up on about an hour 15.
Hour 15?
We'll
Okay.
do another like 15 minutes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we have time for questions and stuff.
Yeah. If there's any questions in the chat about this content,
Yeah.
Yeah. Stop asking
we
me
can
this.
answer. We can answer some game questions.
Yeah, this-
but nothing.
We didn't really talk about staging, but like this is why staging helps, right? Because like here at the end of the flight, why am I carrying all these empty fuel tanks? I could just drop them. What if I make them? I could separate them, and then I can go faster. For this last leg of the trip. Without the weight of these two tanks down here. And the same is true for engines.
And then to save money, you could have them land themselves.
Yeah.
And then you could reuse them.
Smart reuse. Tell Bori about his smart reuse. And the same is true for engines, right? The lower stage engines, they need to be big and powerful to get you off the pad. But as you go up, they're overpowered, and they're heavy. They're way heavier than you need. Generally speaking, all things being equal, a bigger engine pushes harder, and if you don't need as much push, then you don't need as much engine. So get rid of those engines, right? As you've spent their stages, you can drop them and use weaker but more efficient engines. Why?
There's a request that the next time we do this, that the students should do their own rockets.
Oh, yes.
I disagree with that chat. They're always trying to get me to draw stuff.
Will they add tutorial for docking in the future? Careful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's noisy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, I think planned docking
yeah.
docking tutorial is planned.
Yeah.
Let's see if there's any other questions.
Don't ask me about the design. I'm less privy to that.
Yeah.
I know as much as chat.
Can you talk about how higher TWR helps for transfer burdens to other bodies?
Yes.
Like how it relates to the Oberth effect.
Yeah. Well, that.
You already have the slide
chat,
prepared.
that is the whole next course,
Yeah.
which is all about
Rocketry 102.
Rocketry 102, where we have the there's a whole slide on the Oberth effect in here. Here he is.
So next time.
Yeah. Next time, we'll talk about the Oberth effect.
Oh, that's not this one.
Yeah.
That dude?
Yeah, you've been to this
I
class.
was at that class.
Yeah, you've been to this class.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, that's Rocketry 102. I got so many lesson plans, guys. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. I got one about powered descent. It's awesome. I'm working on orbital rendezvous. This is really hard to explain.
Well, that's a good idea. Give a little peeks of some of these. That's
Yeah,
good.
it's going to be fun.
When is next time? When we get the time?
When we get the time, yeah.
We got good dates.
There's JFK. We're going to land on the Mun.
We're planning on doing a stream next week.
We are.
So,
It's not going to be this.
but that's going to be more fun.
It's going to be more fun stream,
More
less
like the other
less
one, right?
education
More
stream.
like the other
Part two.
Yeah.
First one, right?
Yeah, we're going to try to. So the last time we stranded Tim on Duna
Yeah.
because of my very bad flying
Rescue.
and trying to get to the monument. I think we stranded him on the opposite side of the planet from where the monument is. And so now, next week, I need to redeem myself and rescue him and get to the monument and get home. So
Yes.
Nate and I are going to try to do that.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. So, cool. Do you want to wrap up here?
Yeah, let's wrap up. So thanks for joining us. This is our pilot of KSP Academy, or at least the public version of KSP Academy, and we hope you liked it. And I hope I get to do more of these because it's fun to explain things, and I learn a lot in doing the research for these little presentations. So thanks for tuning in.
Just like you guys were saying, you want to see more of this. If you want to see more, you gotta give upvotes, and you gotta tell Dakota you love them.
Like and subscribe.
You gotta
Like, subscribe,
like
leave
and
a comment.
subscribe. It's
Smash that
true,
like
it's also
button.
dumb, but like,
And if you missed the beginning of it, we'll
I don't
upload
have
the
a
VOD
future
to
career as a YouTuber.
YouTube,
yeah.
and we'll share that.
But the more positive feedback, the more stuff like this happens. That's just the way it is.
Lots of love for you folks.
Yay!
More positive feedback, and no more
Bye,
Dakota
everybody.
randomly posted me on Twitch out of the blue. Yeah, he deserves it. Get him on camera.
Oh, no. Okay. No. Oh, you're on camera.
Yeah.
Will the slides be posted afterwards? We could, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah, we could post them on Discord,
Yeah, that'd be
or
fun.
maybe on the forums.
Yeah. They're not really slides because they're all like interlocked.
Yeah, they're not really slides.
It
they're
got chaotic,
Photoshop
but I'll
layers.
try. Yeah, there are many Photoshop layers, but I will
Yeah.
try to make them
Yeah.
succinct.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time.
See ya.